This is a handoff. I have the privilege of introducing Howard Markel, and Howard will introduce Andrew a little bit for those who weren't there this afternoon, and then we're going to have a dialogue. It's just a question and answer. Howard is the George E. Wantz Distinguished Professor of the History of Medicine and Director of the Center of History of Medicine at the University of Michigan. I want you to watch this litany and count on your fingers. He's also a professor of psychiatry, public health, history, English literature and language, pediatrics, and communicable diseases. Can you repeat them after me? Howard's the author, co-author, or co-editor of 10 books, including his most recent award-winning book, An Anatomy of Addiction, Sigmund Freud, William Halsted, and the Miracle Drug Cocaine. This book was a New York Times bestseller and the Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He has appeared on numerous national radio and television news broadcasts and in film, documentaries about the history of medicine and public health. His book about how germs travel is actually scientific but captivating. And it's you can hear him, you do hear him on ABC, NBC, PBS, BBC, CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and the History Channel. I think you've been on all of them. I encourage you, I could go on, but I encourage you to just...
But not MTV.
Not MTV. Yeah. I encourage you to just Google Howard Markel, MD, and learn so much more. You will love what you learn. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Howard for, I mentioned it earlier today, but for generous support from the Center for the History of Medicine for this evening's event. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Markel.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce Andrew Solomon, who is a National Book Award-winning author, journalist, novelist, activist, an all-around incredible guy. Now, if I were to list all of Andrew's accomplishments, there would be no time left to ask any questions. So let me just express my first thought when I was reading this book, Far From the Tree. And I think it'll describe this thought, how special he is. It's a hefty tome. It's more than 950 pages. It's based on over 300 interviews, which took up some 40,000 pages of transcripts. There's thousands of citations. And I thought this book is so thorough, it's so scholarly, it's so thoughtful, that Andrew would have a wonderful career here as a professor at the University of Michigan, if only he didn't write so well. That would harm your academic career.
I can tell, yes. I'll just add parenthetically that I've been doing a PhD, and my supervisor said to me, you should bear in mind that the more charming your prose is, the less seriously it will be taken.
Yes. That's right. If one word is good, 12 must be better. Right. Well, you're here today, I have to pay rent here and mention something about depression. So Andrew, of course, is here in his capacity as on the National Advisory Board of the University of Michigan Depression Center. You've been on that board since 2003. You've written your National Book Award book was The Noonday Demon, about depression, where you became a historian of sadness, as you called yourself, but not only writing compellingly about your own depression and what you went through, but also a broad view of the disease called depression. And I guess I'd like, and you've written elsewhere as well about depression, so why don't we talk a little bit about your involvement with the Depression Center and your work as an activist to destigmatize this terribly debilitating mental health illness?
Well, I'll start by saying that my childhood friend Steve Rossoff, who's here tonight, was editing the alumni magazine for the University of Michigan, and said to me when I was doing research on depression that there was some awfully interesting work going on here, and suggested that I come out and do a piece for the alumni magazine, which I did many years since. So that was my original introduction. And I was very lucky because there were lots of people who were shilling for all kinds of university departments where not very much that was of interest was going on. And there were any number of really brilliant scientists whom I got to meet and talk with in Michigan, and they have a significant presence in that book. And of course, all under the leadership of John Graydon, who's done such extraordinary work. I feel like the idea of having a depression center altogether was really quite a radical idea, the idea that one should deal with depression in the way that one had previously dealt with cancer. And instead of saying, well, there are departments of psychiatry, there's someone who does good work in depression here, there's some clinical services there, having it all so diffuse, it was all going to be brought together, it was going to be centralized, it was going to be given a profound coherence as a field of study and as an area of treatment. And I think that's invaluable, and I think that the idea of having a national network of depression centers, also one of John's ideas, has really been transformative in the field. As someone who suffers from depression myself, and who therefore meets a lot of other people who suffer from it, worries about it for my own children, and so on and so forth, it's infinitely reassuring to me to feel that this structure has been added to the field. So I pay tribute. I know you're paying tribute to me tonight, but I pay tribute back to the whole center.
And I actually had a comment there that I forgot because I was so nervous, but John really has been a pioneer in all this, and so I think we owe a little bit. Now, you know, when I was a pediatrician, we always used to quote Dr. Spock, which has a very famous opening line, "You know more than you think, trust yourself." And your book begins with a great line, "There is no such thing as reproduction. When two people decide to have a baby, they engage in an act of production. Widespread use of the word reproduction is for this activity, with its implication that two people are but braiding themselves together, is at best a euphemism to comfort prospective parents before they get in over their heads." Now, in the book, and you begin this, you talked a little bit about this during your lecture, but you hit on a very novel and I think brilliant concept of identities. And you talk about vertical identities, so things that you sometimes inherit or are passed down from your parents. It can be DNA, but could also be cultural norms or ethnicity or things like that, and how those are different from horizontal identities. So things that include sexuality, as you talked about in the book, and well, a great many things, criminal behavior, prodigy behavior, certain mutations that cause disabilities and so on, but that those people, those children need to get their identities from a peer group rather than from their parents. Well, to me as a historian, this is just a game changer. I mean, this is a real change over time. And it really turns the whole notion of families, of parenting, of how we relate to one another on its head in a very, very productive and positive way. But how did you come to observe this? This is a brainstorm that you must have had at some point. And what led you to think of this novel concept?
It really began with my work on deafness and my understanding that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and my experience of how many problems deaf children have as a result of having hearing parents who are not well equipped to understand the possibility that their deafness may be constructed as an identity. And I saw a real parallel between that and the gay experience. Mm-hmm. I think all of this book, even though it only discusses gayness or autobiography sort of briefly in the opening and closing chapters, really is informed by that sensibility, that experience of being an outsider in that regard. There were many other regards in which I was, reasonably an insider, but the gayness made me different, and the difference was very traumatic for me. And my family, who are incredibly loving and to whom I'm deeply devoted and with whom I have a relatively unambivalent, warm, intimate relationship. I mean, my husband and my son and I now spend every weekend at my father's house. We're all together, constantly. But I think that they were ill-equipped to deal with the strangeness that I presented. They were uncomfortable with it. They were ill at ease with it. My mother was disappointed by it. My father thought it was not the easiest path forward. And I think that whole experience of feeling, and it took me a long time. I mean, I was very unhappy in my adolescence. I would have done almost anything to be straight instead. Indeed, I tried some rather extreme things to see whether I could bring about that change. And it took me a long time to arrive at a sense of identity and at a sense of self-regard in some sense. And I think that was the experience that informed all of the rest of this, because I began seeing that experience, which I thought was my private traumatic experience, was an experience that I shared in one form or another with a vast body of people. And the more I delved into it, the more categories there seemed to be in which this was the case. The book ended up focusing on 10 different conditions, but it could have focused on 100 different conditions if there were people out there wanting to buy books that are 7,000 pages long. So.
Now, what I've noticed about all of your books is that you're an incredibly immersive writer. I mean, you're a character in both this book and The Noonday Demon. And when you interview others, it's clear, anyone who knows you, you're a very, very charming and elegant man. You connect to people very well. You clearly connected to all the people you interviewed. And many of the stories, some are stories of triumph, some are not. Many of them are poignant, some are downright sad. And so when you touched a little bit on this earlier, but for somebody who has had suffered with depression, how is that immersing yourself in the worlds of so many sad stories? How did that affect you as a person and as a writer?
Well, as a person, it's difficult some of the time. I mean, the stories are painful, a lot of them, and encountering so much of other people's pain can exacerbate some of my own. And, you know, it was hard to do aspects of this book. But I also met a lot of people I really liked, whether they'd had good experiences or bad experiences. I try in general to write about people I like or respect or admire. And I feel by and large what came out of the encounters I had in this book were, you know, some real friendships and some situations in which I think there was warmth, at least from my side and perhaps from the other. But, you know, and there were a few people who I sort of thought seemed crazy and difficult, and they continue to seem that way. But essentially, the thing of connecting with people is good. But I think also I would take some words from your very moving talk earlier. I felt when I was writing the depression book that part of my objective was to take an experience I'd had which felt while I was having it, or while it was at its worst, like a barren, useless, hollow, empty thing, and make something that might be of worth and of use to other people out of it. And I felt that the people who were telling me their stories often described how difficult it was for them to tell me their stories. And I said, why did you decide to do it? And they said, I felt so alone in the experience I had. And I hope that by telling my story, I'll help other people to feel less alone. And part of depression, I think, is the sense of isolation and aloneness. And the writing of this book was a very rewardingly intimate process. And so at the level of that intimacy, it was an antidote to depression, even though at the level of the pain that was being described and that I then had to re-describe in my own writing, it was in some instances very hard.
Mm-hmm. But healing nevertheless.
But healing, yes.
Well, I have to mention an Ann Arbor story. We have here Kiki Peck and her mother, Chrissy Trapani. Now, Kiki has Nice dysplasia, which is a random mutation that leads to a rare variant of dwarfism and multiple disabilities. Chrissy herself is a cancer survivor. I found this one of the most inspiring stories, that I found myself sitting next to them, and I was so excited because I was cheering you on last weekend. I don't know if your ears were burning, but I was thinking about you. And one of the most inspiring facets of the story is the remarkable resilience. And it's not just Kiki and Chrissy, but many of the other characters that you've described, people you've described, in the face of just remarkable adversity. And it's clearly a quality that is undoubtedly added to the quality of all these people's lives. And I think Chrissy said it best. I'm going to quote her. I used to run marathons, and someone told me once that if you smile the whole way, you won't feel the pain. It worked. So that's what I do with this too. Now maybe I should ask this of Chrissy, but I'll ask you, because it's such a fabulous credo. As someone who is perennially negative, I wake up in the morning already having 3 catastrophes. So I'm asking this for me more than anybody else. How do you acquire such a skill? What can you take to get this skill? And what in your own life and work has taught you about the critical importance of resiliency, something that psychologists and doctors have told us for years is critical in good outcomes with health challenges?
So people have been asking me for years what the unifying theme is of my work. My first book was about a group of Soviet artists and how their lives changed during Glasnost. My second book was a novel that was loosely based on the period of my mother's illness and death. My third book was the depression book. And my fourth book, as you've doubtless gathered by now, is Far from the Tree. Parents, Children, and the Search for Identity. And for a long time I thought, what is it that I write about that recurs? And it was finally in writing this book that I thought, it's about turning circumstances of adversity to some form of good. It's about resilience, and it's about trying to understand resilience. And I think I wanted to understand resilience because it was a quality that I particularly wanted to have myself, that I felt I did have in some measure, but that I wanted to understand and that I wanted to strengthen. So, and the stories of the families I wrote about were very inspiring to me. You know, people sometimes say, how can these families possibly do this? And I was humbled by a lot of the families that I met with and that I spoke to, but I was also impressed that people are able to accommodate almost any reality that is their reality, whether they're Rwandan rape victims or people with very disabling conditions or people in any sort of situation at all there. One adjusts to one's reality, and one's degree of resilience is something that is there and that underlies the way that you interact with whatever the difficult reality is that you have. And I found, I mean, I'm sorry, it's strange to be talked about possibly from the front of the room when you're sitting here, but you know, I feel like in my interactions, Kiki has seemed to me to be unbelievably positive and enthusiastic and energetic, and also amazingly talented as a singer. If you're lucky, you might get a song out of her later. But I just was blown away by people whose lives looked so difficult and who nonetheless seemed to be managing to get a lot of joy out of life itself. And as someone who had a life that in some ways didn't look so difficult and had gone through an experience of depression, I wanted to try to unlock the secret of that. And I don't know that I've unlocked the secret, but I certainly understand it much better than I did before I began.
Let's talk a little bit about autism. And you have a wonderful chapter on autism, but I'm going to veer a little bit here. You touched briefly on the work of Andrew Wakefield. Now, Wakefield, if you don't know about him, is a physician in Britain who published a paper in Lancet, which is a very prestigious medical journal. It was in 1998. And he putatively linked autism, the rise of autism, to the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, or specifically a mercury-based preservative that used to be put into that measles vaccine. That work has since been absolutely proven to be false. The British Medical Council has declared him dishonest and irresponsible. I think Time magazine called him one of the 100 worst scientists in the history of science. And yet, Wakefield remains quite a hero in the autism community. And even in the general community, measles vaccines have plummeted for a while. And that's a huge problem because measles is still a serious disease. Very few people remember what it was like to have measles, but even a benign case of measles makes you quite sick, and 1 out of 4,000 children who get measles will die. And yet, in the autism activist community, Wakefield's still a hero, and this myth is still perpetuated. So you write in many different points in your book, and I thoroughly agree that activism is a tonic to difference. It's a way of getting out of that negative or that hole that you may find yourself in. Those are the good things about activism. Here we have an issue of activism with this type of false research that actually harms the public health, because any infectious disease is a communal disease. So would you comment on that irony?
Well, I think I would start by saying that there are a variety of standpoints among people with autism who are activists. There is no more divided, fractious, confusing community to deal with than the autism community. And there are many people in it who were, from the very start, horrified by Wakefield's proposition, who said that it was ridiculous to suggest that somebody's profound neurological wiring and essential identity had been caused by poisoning. They thought it was insulting and ludicrous. So the people who are adherents of Wakefield, I mean, there are many of them, and it is extraordinary that there are many of them given what happened, but they're still a relatively small group of people. When my children were born, had dinner with Tom Insel, the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, and I said, what would your take finally be on this vaccine business? And he said, there is absolutely no evidence to link vaccines with autism. He said, but you can never fully disprove something, and there are an awful lot of parents who claim to have seen a correlation. And I think if it were my child who had just been born, I would do all the vaccinations, but I would do them on a slower schedule. And that's in fact what we did. I feel like there's so much uncertainty out there. There's so much confusion. There have been so many people with so many strange theories. And autism itself remains so profoundly incomprehensible at the biomolecular level, incomprehensible in its etiology, incomprehensible at every possible level. And I think that kind of uncertainty breeds panic in the same way that I think the uncertainty and fear that there have been around all kinds of other diseases that were not understood historically has bred a lot of panic. You know, until we understood what they were, we had to blame somebody or something. And I think what everyone would like to think about autism is A, I can protect my child from it, and B, it was caused by something that we can understand, and because we can understand it, it need never trouble me. And I think at that level, the vaccine hypothesis is very attractive to people. They feel like, oh, I know what it is, and I'm taking care of it. It isn't going to be here. They have a whole agenda of control. Mm-hmm. And I think in the name of that agenda of control, this tragic thing of children dying of measles has happened. I mean, in Britain, I have a bad head for numbers, but essentially no one had died of measles in something like 35 years, and the year after Wakefield's report came out, 26 children or something like that died, and you think, okay, children are dying. What I wonder is how Andrew Wakefield can live with himself knowing that he has in fact caused all of these, effectively caused children to die. So far as I'm concerned, he has blood on his hands. But I think there are a lot of subtle social reasons why people have been drawn to his hypothesis.
Now, with respect to prodigies, the wonderful chapter, I want to tell you a brief anecdote. When I was a practicing pediatrician, I would see the most beautiful, most talented, most brilliant child 25 times a day. So every parent would tell me that. Every parent. Now, I actually have the most beautiful, brilliant.
No, I do.
My wife will corroborate it, and that's my professional opinion. But you actually met parents who have these brilliantly talented children. Many of them were musicians, for example. And so I was wondering, what are the commonalities you saw in these parents? How did they first recognize that their child had this rather remarkable ability? And how did they accommodate that talent? Because they may not have that ability or skill, or how did they get the resources for that child and so on? What did you notice when you met these people?
Well, your description of the 25 brilliant ones a day actually has a certain symmetry with my experience, which is that there are parents who desperately want to have children who are prodigies and who push their children to accomplish at an extraordinary level incredibly early, and whose children have enough talent so that they can do it, but the whole prodigy phenomenon is being driven by the parents. And then there were cases I encountered in which the children had an extraordinary ability and the parents really just wanted things to be normal, but they couldn't just keep them normal because the child had climbed up on the piano bench when he was 8 months old and started playing, songs that he'd heard and so on and so forth. There was this extreme circumstance. And I felt as though half of the parents were pushing their kids really hard and half of the parents were trying to hold their kids back. And it wasn't so easy to see where the balance lay. I think one should always emphasize that what a prodigy does is to perform at an adult level before the age of 10, usually considerably younger than that. But the fact that such a child has developed quickly and is able to perform at an adult level before the age of 10 does not mean that that child at the age of 30 will be able to perform any better, or indeed often not as well as other people who didn't develop so early. So early development and profound development often get confused. And I think a lot of the parents some of them were intimidated by their own children. Some of them projected their own dreams onto their children and thought that because the thing that would have made the parent happy was to be acknowledged as a genius, that was what was going to make the child happy. I ended up thinking, I hope my children do incredibly well. I hope they have vast successes. I'd be thrilled if they win the Nobel Prize. I would not be so thrilled, frankly, if they were at the ages they now are of 4 and 5.5, if they were functioning at this kind of an advanced level. I think it is very isolating. I think you have the problem of asynchrony, that either your 6-year-old spends all of his time with adults who aren't really very interested in the emotional life of a 6-year-old, but understand where he is intellectually, or spends time with other 6-year-olds who have absolutely no idea what he's talking about. And I think either one of those things can be problematical. I think part of what one really wants, and in a way it's a central message of the book, is to have peers and to have like peers. And I think prodigies, by and large, are deprived of peers, even if there are some special gifted programs where they can meet a few other prodigies. Essentially, I think it's a lonely experience.
Okay, I'm getting a 5-minute mark here. That's good. So okay, there. I feel like Johnny Carson. Parents and parenting are major themes, I think, in all of your work. It's not just Far From the Tree. You've written a great deal about your relationship with your parents, who sound like remarkable people, as well as your own concerns that as a gay man you would never be a parent. And during the course of writing this book, as you talked about a little bit earlier, you married your wonderful husband, John, and you also became a parent. And as you said in the book, you have a family structure that would be utterly unimaginable 50 years ago. And I suspect this book was critical to inspiring your own desire to be a parent. And the last line, well, I like the first line, I like the last line, I like every line in between, but the last line of your book, sometimes I thought the heroic parents in this book were fools, enslaving themselves to a life's journey with their alien children, trying to breed identity out of misery. I was startled to learn that my research had built me a plank, and I was ready to join the ship. That's such a beautiful sentiment. I mean, it just captures parenting. You know, in what we all share, anyone who has a child. Can you elaborate for us about your own inspiring transformation from adult to parent, and how your work not only edifies all of your readers, millions of readers, but also has made you a better man and a better father?
Well, I don't know whether talking about what made me a better man is necessarily, it sounds a little egomaniacal. But
how about a better father?
I think, and I just would like to add that in the talk I gave earlier, there was only one sentence of my own that I had memorized, and that was it. Yeah. So you all will have heard it a little earlier and heard it again now. But I liked my own conclusion, too. You know, I felt when I was growing up that I had to make this very difficult decision. I either was going to be gay and therefore not have a family, which was certainly the rule for gay people when I was growing up, and I very much wanted a family, or I was going to have a family and have to be dishonest about the fact that I was gay and live in denial of that side of myself. And it appeared that the two things I wanted, which were to be able to live in a genuine loving relationship and to be able to be a father, were incompatible. And now it's turned out in my adult life that they're not incompatible at all. And the feeling I had when I worked on the book was that that revelation indicated to me that other things that currently seem impossible or incompatible may seem possible 50 years from now, and I wonder what a lot of them will be. That understanding in turn, if anything, has made me a sort of better person. I think it broadened my perspective and gave me a real feeling of possibility, and I think that sense of possibility has helped me to be less judgmental of other people and of the things that they may want. And I think working on the book allowed me to understand that my own children were going to present some surprises, and there were going to be disappointments, and there were going to be strangenesses, and that none of those things need interfere with a steadiness of love. They made me feel prepared to go on loving my children through whatever it is they present. I mean, they're still pretty little, so you can check back with me in a decade when they're adolescents and see how that's going. But I think that was really the great idea of it.
Just a wonderful book. Now, I have one personal question. Will you sign my copy? Thanks so much.
Utmost pleasure. Thank you all.
For those of you who watch certain channels that I mentioned earlier that Howard tends to go on, does he not remind you of Charlie Rose? The final event for this evening is brief and it's enjoyable. It's bestowing the Depression Center's Mike Wallace Award. The Mike Wallace Award recognizes an outstanding individual who has personally and publicly demonstrated exceptional commitment, courage, support, and leadership in a manner that is consistent with the Depression Center's mission to destigmatize and conquer depression's bipolar illnesses and related disorders. The two previous recipients of this award were Mike Wallace himself and mental health advocate, journalist, and author Kathy Cronkite, daughter of Walter Cronkite. A radio and television journalist, a UM alum, and passionate advocate for people living with depressions, Mike Wallace died in April 2012 at age 93. He was one of the earliest and most prominent Americans to discuss his personal experience with depression publicly. Mike served as an inaugural member of the Depression Center's National Advisory Board, along with Andrew. After the Depression Center's endorsement by the Board of Regents in 2001, regental representation here today, he helped the center prepare an exceptional video about the need for a Depression Center of Excellence. He served as Master of Ceremonies when we opened the new Rachel Upjohn Building facility in 2006, and he understood and supported the value of our national network of depression centers, now numbering 20 around the country with its home here. Mike's forthright messages, for those of you who remember his style, his forthright messages, his unique voice, his sneaking up on things, it made him almost impossible to ignore. He was powerful in puncturing the national conspiracy of silence about mental illnesses. He described his own personal experiences, presented them with his superb media skills and well-known persona of confidence, and in the process virtually compelled everyone to listen, learn, think, and challenge any of their own remnants of misguided attitudes and misinformation. This legacy helped show the way. We still have much to do to achieve the vision that we shared and that he shared with us, and we must continue to carry that torch. We miss Mike, but times move on. Andrew Solomon is with us tonight because of his latest book, as you've all seen. And when he received the National Book Award for The Noonday Demon, he was describing his own experiences, and now you see the loop close in this. I can think of no one more deserving of the Mike Wallace Award than someone who has become an equally powerful voice for the same goals. Please join me in acknowledging the remarkable Andrew Solomon. And
thank you, John. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
I hope it's not totally irreverent, but when I was in New York with Renee, actually, and we showed this to him, and he said, I guess it looks a little bit like me. It is very nice, and it's special to us,
Very noble.
so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good.
And now, the only other thing that I just wish to acknowledge once more is the Crazy Wisdom Bookstore, and to remind people that if they didn't hear anything today, or if you want more, in addition to getting the book, there is a book signing tomorrow, again, at Crazy Wisdom.
If you're not
And
sick
that
to
concludes
death of
our
the sound of
evening.
my voice by now.
Thank you. Drive safely, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Lovely. Goodbye.
Thank you.